Greetings and welcome to From the Basement. This is the first video in the Unity Terrain tutorial series. This is being done with Unity version 5.2. As this is the first video in the series, we're not going to produce anything actually usable. It's just going to be a quick overview of all of the common controls that you will be using in the course of sculpting terrain in Unity. So, let's get started. First, to create a terrain, we go into Game Object, 3D Object, and Terrain. This will place a terrain in our hierarchy. It will also place a new terrain inside our root of our assets folder. With each new terrain we produce, we will get new terrain 1, new terrain 2, so on and so forth. I highly recommend that for production, you rename and reorganize the location of this asset. With the terrain selected, you will see the terrain bar over here in the inspector. In order, we have raise lower terrain, paint height, smooth height, paint texture, place trees, paint details, and terrain settings. In addition to using the mouse to click on these buttons, you can also use Shift and QWERTY, Q-W-E-R-T-Y, to access the various areas. The gearbox you have to manually click on. Do note that since Shift is used to speed up your navigation in your fly-throughs in a Unity level, it is very easy to do a Shift W and accidentally switch to the Paint Height tool. Be aware of that, and of course always remember that Control Z for undo is your friend in case you don't notice it in time. Alright, going through these in order. Raise lower terrain. Very useful hint here. Click to raise, hold down Shift to lower. We have a variety of brushes that will give us a wide range of patterns. Why we have a star, I don't know, but it's kind of fun to play around with. So if I left click and drag, I will get raise terrain, shift click drag, I will lower it. Now currently my values are completely out of control. Let's look at our settings, brush size and opacity. Brush size does exactly what you think it does. It controls how big the brush is. Obviously setting it extremely small doesn't do much good when you have a pattern brush. Setting it extremely large can also sometimes cause problems, but it's easier to demonstrate what the actual brush looks like. Opacity is a little bit misnamed, but at least they keep the misname throughout all of these brushes. This actually controls the brush strength, how much change is applied with every movement of the mouse. So at 100, a single click generates quite a bit of change, whereas at 0, a single click produces barely any change. I actually kind of have to squiggle it quite a bit to be able to start seeing a change. How change is applied is on the first mouse click, turn it back up to 100 here, on the first mouse click you get 1 unit of change. If I can release the mouse button without moving the mouse, that's all that happens. While you have the mouse button held down, every time you move the mouse, it will send an update to the Unity editor, which means it will also send an update to the brush, causing it to paint down. To show this without it spazzing out quite so hard, there we go. Shift left click will of course shrink things down. So I'm going to switch to a circle brush here and just melt things down. Notice that the terrain is not lowering past this point right here. This is height 0. You cannot lower the terrain past height 0. Alright, that is enough for raise lower terrain. Let's look at paint height. We still have our same brush options, and they're going to work largely the same way as far as their shape goes. Brush size and opacity also work the same way. Size controlling size, opacity controlling the rate of change. The new option on this one is height. I can set a value between 0 and 600, the 600 being defined in my settings. Clicking this flatten button here will flatten the entire map to whatever that value is. This is a destructive action. It will wipe out all of your terrain sculpting. It will not change your textures, but it will wipe out your terrain sculpting. So if I set this, say, to 5 and click on flatten, it does exactly what it says it does. It flattens it to a height of 5. Now I can shift and go back to raise lower, shift left click, and notice now I can lower the terrain. And actually I'm going to raise up some terrain here to show off the remaining features of the Paint to Height tool. And I'm going to change my height value now to 8. I can now use these brushes just like a regular brush, but we've got some differences. If I am in a spot that is lower than my target height, painting down will raise it up until it hits that height, and then it will plateau out. Conversely, if I am in an area that is higher than what my set height is, it will lower it until it reaches that target height, at which point it plateaus out. It will always bring that spot to the target height. This can be very useful for creating things like terraces and such. So I can change to a circle brush, reduce my brush size here a little bit, maybe, and then just carve in to the side here to create a little terrace. Now the other way of choosing this height, if I don't know what the value is, let's say I want to create a terrace right here on this hill. I can shift left click to grab the height there. Apparently that is 41.1444. And now I can paint out a terrace around the edge here. And that pretty much does it for the Paint Height tool. Smoothing averages out the heights over the area of the brush. So if I stretch this out to 100, leave my opacity kind of low, and you can see it's smoothing out or averaging out the edges, taking away some of the jaggies. Got to be careful of those jaggies because they can really look not good to the player, depending on the art style that you are going for. Turning the opacity up very high does what I like to personally call melting. You can see it just kind of melts and smooths out all of the detail. Just kind of melts it into a big blob, which maybe sometimes is what you want, but that's kind of situational. Once again, the various patterns work exactly as they have in the past. Brush size and opacity, again, size of brush, strength of change. Texturing. Before you can apply textures, you have to add them in. So edit textures, add texture. You can select a albedo and a normal, though the normal is optional. So I am going to select a grass texture, grass hill albedo. The very first texture that you select will be the texture that is applied to the entire terrain. It is also important to note that I am intentionally saying texture, not material. You do not apply materials to terrains, you apply textures. So I'm going to select the grass hill albedo, and now everything is grass. I can add in additional textures, add in a sand texture, and add in a cliff texture. I can then select these down here in this strip. The little blue line here indicates which one I have selected, and I can paint down the texture. Notice that textures go down really, really fast. Now, of course, I have my opacity set to 100, but even if I have my opacity set down to, say, 27, it still goes down really quick, unless I just, like, single click. But even then, if I twitch, even just a small little twitch, and it goes down full strength. Generally speaking, you're going to want to work with your opacity rather low. unless you're doing, just deliberately just trying to paint down broad sweeping strokes. I've also found to have the best result in working with the more patterned brushes in terms of trying to get things to feel right when doing texturing work. And of course, if you spin the mouse, move the mouse a lot with short little movements, you can very quickly apply the texture to one specific area. Target strength limits how much texture can be applied. So switching back to my sand here, if I wanted to apply only 50% strength sand, so I will change this to a 0.5. I'm going to go ahead and increase my opacity up to 100 so the change will be near instant. And regardless of how much I try to paint down, my sand is not going to go above that 50% texture value. Also notice that it does not erase layers other than, or change layers other than its own. I'm on the sand layer. I am only changing the sand layer right now. Obviously, if I change my target strength back up to 100, you can see the difference. That pretty much covers the textures. Moving on to trees. Like textures, we have to add trees in first, so edit trees, add trees. Now, Unity will cheerfully allow you to assign any 3D model to be a tree. I highly recommend against this. It can cause some really weird effects and sometimes crashes. I'm going to stick with the speed tree. I am going to grab the conifer desktop and add that in. Once again, I've got a brush size that will determine the area in which I put down trees. Tree density controls how fast I apply these trees down. A tree density of 6, generally speaking, plops down 6 trees. Don't ask me to explain that one because I can't. Whereas turning my tree density up to 100, a single click pretty much plops down an entire forest. I can shift left click to wipe out trees. In the event that I have multiple trees, which I don't have at the moment, I can hold down Control to erase the specifically selected tree. If I want to plant one tree at a time, I need to adjust my brush size to 1, and now I can place single trees. You can also control the tree height through a random slider here. It is not recommended that you get too crazy with your range, because this can create some very odd results, and depending on how this tree was designed, it might not actually scale properly. And that pretty much, oh nope, one last thing for trees. Mass place trees. It does pretty much what it says it does. If I was to click on place at the moment, it would place 10,000 trees. I can tell it to keep existing trees or tell it, you know what, just wipe out everything. I would recommend against placing 10,000 trees on the default 500 by 500 terrain. As you can see, it's a bit much. Now, when you're using the brush to put down trees, it does not care about height values. It will quite cheerfully allow me to place trees on this vertical surface here. When you do mass place trees, it will not place the trees on surfaces that exceed a certain slope. Now, of course, that is way too many trees, so I'm going to go back to mass place trees and tell it to place 100 trees. Do not keep existing trees, and okay, there we go. That's a lot more sane trees. Moving on, we have details, which is where we can place detail meshes and grass. Once again, we need to add it in, so I'm going to add a grass texture. Again, we're looking at 2D textures, specifically billboard textures. So I'm going to grab this grass frond 01. Again, we have some scaling options here: min width, min height, max height. 1, of course, being the default native size of the image. Noise spread, in other words, how noisy is the spread on the height here. and a healthy and dry color for tinting. Careful, these can get a kind of weird sometimes depending on the tints you choose and the object that you are placing down. Now, if you are too far away, you won't be able to see the grass placed. For instance, I am clicking and placing grass within this little hilltop here, but you can't see it. That is, until you fly in, and suddenly it pops in. Detail view distance is controlled in the settings. You might want to increase it to make editing easier, but be careful about leaving that in for production, depending on the specs of the target machines you want your game to be running on. Detail objects can go down very fast. Again, it is highly recommended on these that you keep your target strength down low and your opacity down low. In this case, target strength won't actually stop the grass from applying down very thickly. Instead, it just seems to be an additional throttle for what a single click is going to do for placing down grass. I would strongly recommend sticking to single clicks for placing down grass, because even on a fairly low setting, a left click drag can place down a lot of grass really fast. Detail objects are a little bit more finicky. I'm going to have to zoom out for this one. I am going to use the outside pack, I always call him Nobiix because that's the name I found him by originally, the free rocks pack. So I'm going to edit, add detail mesh, and I want rock 01. Again, we've got scaling values, the colors, which we'll come back to in a moment. Render mode, though, is really important. I'm going to leave it at grass, which is wrong. I'm going to zoom in, so that way I should be able to see it. I'm going to left click. Actually, it would probably help if I was on the right rock. Oh, and I forgot to select the prefab version, so I need to fix that real quick. I want my textures. I left click, and I get this weird, like, green sparkly stuff floating in midair. What? That's not a rock. Yeah, it gets back to that whole render mode thing. For detail meshes, why they include a grass option when that doesn't render correctly, I don't know. But that needs to be vertex lit. And boom, I got a giant rock in the place. I have another giant rock that's like neon green and pops in crazy like. So I'm talking about the healthy color. You got to be careful with that for detail objects, like for these rocks. This is really not working out so hot. Probably best to say, like, leave the default color to white, in other words, not tinted, and then maybe have the dry color as serving as some kind of a tint. It is worth noting a couple of things here. One, this asset pack was not designed to be used as detail objects. The scale is completely wrong. Two, detail objects do not and cannot have collisions. There is no way to stop the player walking through these. Now, that might be great if I'm sort of like placing them as maybe background elements that the player's never going to reach. But yeah, you got to be careful of detail objects. Generally speaking, this should be for small things that are placed on the ground that you really don't care if the player walks through, and the player isn't going to really care if they walk through. That is the point behind detail objects. Moving on, we have our settings. Now, way too many settings here to go over in this video, so I'm going to hit on the three most important: terrain width, terrain length, terrain height. By default, you will have a 500 meter wide by 500 meter long terrain with a height variance of 600 meters. That's a pretty big terrain. It's questionable as to whether or not you would need a larger one, especially if the player is going to be playing from a first-person perspective. If you're wanting to have a massively large world, like, say, maybe Skyrim or Witcher 3 or something like that, you are generally better off following in Skyrim's footsteps and using multiple terrain patches, which is far beyond the scope of this video. But yeah, 500 by 500 by 600 is a pretty big terrain. That's also a pretty massive height difference. To give you an example of what that difference will look like. I am going to flatten everything to 0. Notice again, it does not alter my textures. My trees, by the way, stay grounded. So if I come in here, my trees do stay grounded to the terrain, even though the terrain moved. I'm going to grab my paint to height, make sure it's at opacity's 100, zoom way the heck out. And let's increase my brush size here. And there we go. Height 600. That's pretty darn tall. To look at it from the reverse. Yeah. So 600 height difference is pretty extreme. And that concludes the basic overview of the terrain system. Check the description below for links to other videos in the series covering different topics. Until then, have a good time creating.